Snow pressed down on the helicopter base like a slow, grinding weight. Winds tore sideways across the tarmac, slicing visibility to almost nothing. Nothing flew that morning. Not the Chinooks, not the Blackhawks. Orders were clear. The storm had locked down every bird and nobody argued. Inside the ops tent, crews hunched around heaters, trading updates and checking manifests that weren't going to change. Flight slots stayed red, engines cold, every crew grounded. From the outside, the tent looked like it might collapse under the gusts. But she stepped through the flap anyway. No one turned to look. She didn't wear flight gear, just a dull gray jacket buttoned to the top, dark pants tucked into worn boots. Her braid was tight frozen at the edges. A clipboard rested under her arm, plain and unremarkable. Nobody spoke to her. Nobody needed to. She wasn't scheduled, wasn't cleared. Her name didn't show up anywhere. She didn't stop walking. Past the idle birds, past the rows of grounded techs. Her boots left small marks in the snow, but the wind erased them as quickly as they appeared. Across the field, half shrouded in frost, sat a single Blackhawk, unmoved, unlogged. She reached it without hesitation, standing there for a moment, not to think, but to feel. The wind bit through her collar. The hangar lights behind her flickered in the haze. She didn't check with anyone. She didn't radio ahead. She just moved. Gloved fingers worked each tie on the cover. The tarp slid off, slowly dragging a ribbon of snow with it. She circled the aircraft, one hand trailing along the frame, stopping briefly at the tail, the nose, the skids. Every motion had purpose. Nothing wasted. No panic. Just familiarity. The kind that doesn't need permission. Inside the cockpit, she moved as if she belonged. No hesitation. Switches flipped. Systems warmed. A single key turned in a hidden slot beneath the console. Engines stirred, coughing against the cold before rising to a deep rumble. Blades creaked, then started to spin. She sat still, eyes scanning instruments, one hand resting on the trim. The radio didn't light up. No calls came through. In the tower, a technician blinked at the radar screen, unsure whether the new blip was a ghost or a glitch. There was no call sign. No assigned crew. Just one aircraft moving slowly, lifting into the wind. Outside, no one noticed right away. The ops tent was still full. People were still waiting. But on the far edge of the tarmac, a storm began to shift as the Blackhawk cut through the first curtain of sleet. The bird climbed steady angle, sharp tail tilting into the crosswind. Inside, the woman didn't speak. Her eyes stayed forward. Hands sure. The clipboard, once tucked at her side, now sat behind her seat. No one had asked her to fly. No one had written her name, but she flew anyway. Madison Hayes had once been a name they all knew. Years back, her call sign used to echo through the tower, clipped and confident, part of the routine chatter that made up every mission cycle. But now, it was just a name on an old ID badge, the letters faded from years of wear and never updated. She walked the base each day in silence, moving through the hangars and operations tents like she was part of the background. No one asked her for input. No one looked her way when decisions were made. She had been grounded after an incident that no one brought up anymore. Not because they respected her past, but because they had forgotten it. Her position now was logistics support. She tracked cargo, marked manifests, updated checklists that pilots glanced at for half a second before tossing aside. Her uniform didn't carry any rank worth noticing, just clean lines, neutral colors, and a badge that still said she had access, but not authority. Most people didn't even know she had flown. The new recruits thought she was just another admin. She never corrected them. She never reminded anyone that she had logged over 800 hours in hostile terrain, that she had once been first in, last out. The stories didn't matter now. She carried herself with a kind of quiet that wasn't meek, but worn, like someone who knew what it meant to be counted out, but kept showing up anyway. Her hair stayed tied back in the same low braid each day, no frills, just functional. Her boots were old but well kept. Her clipboard always had fresh notes, though no one ever asked for them. She had stopped trying to get back into rotation a long time ago. Requests got ignored, evaluations delayed. She was told to wait for review windows that never opened. Eventually, they told her she could still help, just not in the air. She accepted it without argument, at least out loud. Still, She showed up early, stayed late, walked the pads when no one was watching. She had a habit of running pre-checks on grounded birds, not because she was assigned, but because she couldn't help herself. It was in her hands. In the way she touched each panel, tested tension by feel. Muscle memory didn't care what the manifest said. She didn't have a call sign anymore. No patch on her shoulder, no seat assigned. But she kept the routines alive in small, hidden ways. A checklist folded neatly in her back pocket. A weather report downloaded before sunrise. A quiet scan of each board posted near the tent flap, even though her name was never there. Most days no one spoke to her beyond a passing nod. Sometimes not even that. But she kept coming, because something in her refused to step back fully. Because part of her still believed that the air remembered her, even if the people didn't. And because deep down she knew the sky didn't care who had the right paperwork. It only asked one thing. Can you fly? Madison's room sat near the edge of the barracks, tucked away from the warmth of the heaters and far from the busy walkways. It was narrow, just wide enough for a cot, a shelf, and the crate she used as a table. The blanket was always folded the same way, corners, square edges aligned. Above her cot, a map was pinned with 4 old tax corners curling slightly from the dry air. She had drawn it herself, layering lines over faded military charts marking wind routes, drop points, and risk zones no one bothered to update. A small tablet blinked beside it, running a looping simulation of airflow over the pass. She adjusted the elevation slider with her knuckle eyes narrowing on a sharp dip in the terrain. It wasn't an official route, but she had seen it flyable once years ago with her father. Back then she rode behind him wrapped in a thick canvas coat, her legs barely reaching the seat's edge. The gloves sat on the shelf above her, worn leather cracked at the seams, one thumb patched with tape. They had been his. He had flown supply runs through mountain storms with half-working gauges and a window that never fully sealed. He never trusted autopilot. He flew by sound, by vibration, by gut. He used to say you didn't learn cold weather flight by reading manuals. You learned by listening, by feel. He taught her how to check a rotor seam with just a fingertip, how to hear the weight shift in the blades before a tilt. Those things stuck. They stayed in her hands even now. Each night she opened a black notebook and wrote quietly, filling lines with numbers, timestamps, wind logs, downwash behavior, and sim results. She never showed them to anyone. No one asked. But she kept going. Not because she thought it would get her back in the cockpit, but because it was who she was. That notebook had flown more hours in her mind than most pilots on base had in real time. She studied the data, compared it to memory-made corrections, noted anomalies. Her handwriting was small and tight, every line squeezed with care, every margin used. It was a map of her persistence line by line. She didn't need anyone to read it. The act of writing was enough, just like wearing the gloves during her checks. They didn't make her better. They reminded her of where she came from, of who taught her what mattered. Feel it or don't fly. That was what he used to say. The heater in her room barely worked, but she liked the cold. It kept her alert, kept her honest. She didn't fill the space with decorations or noise, just the tools she trusted, the habits she kept, and the silence that let her remember what flight felt like. Even grounded, she never left the sky behind. In that small, forgotten room, Madison stayed ready, not for orders, not for recognition, but for the one moment she knew would come when someone needed a pilot and no one else could fly. And when that happened, she wouldn't need to ask. She would just go. The briefing room was too warm, crowded with bodies and stale coffee. Voices overlapped as people gathered around the mission board shoulders, brushing boots squeaking on the wet floor. A K-9 unit had missed check-in. Last known coordinates marked deep in the ridge, near an old relay site that was now almost unreachable. The storm had locked everything down for hours. Wind shear was rising. Visibility was less than 50 meters. One tech said the dog would probably outlast the handler if they were smart enough to stay put. Commanders stood in a loose cluster near the front, trading fast-clipped sentences. Someone mentioned waiting for a satellite drift report. Another listed how many flight-ready birds were still on the ground. They weren't debating the danger. That part was clear. The question was whether anyone would actually go. No one volunteered. Not one hand raised, not one pilot offered. The board stayed the same. Red markers canceled ops, scrubbed flights. One line sat empty near the bottom, the only slot without a name. Madison stood just inside the door away from the heater clipboard tucked tight against her chest. She wasn't called on. No one made room. She wasn't even supposed to be in the room. But she watched the bored eyes fixed on that single blank space. She took one step forward, voice steady but not loud. She said they hadn't moved in over 90 minutes. Static position. That meant they were either sheltering or unable to relocate. It meant time was closing in. The nearest officer barely glanced at her. He said it was too risky for one dog. His tone wasn't cruel, just final. Like he'd done the math and the math didn't care. Someone chuckled near the side table. Said she could take a sled if she cared so much. A ripple of laughter followed. Not mean, just dismissive. Like she wasn't even in the conversation. Like she hadn't said anything at all. She didn't react, didn't move, didn't try to explain why she knew that terrain better than anyone there. She had flown that pass before, not just in simulations but in weather almost this bad. Her notes on that shelf back in her room matched this storm shift line by line. The group stayed tight around the display. One younger pilot glanced at her eyes, lingering a little longer. He didn't speak either. He just looked, then looked away again. Someone suggested holding until 1400 hours. They'd reassess once the satellite data came through. Another voice said, maybe the team had already found cover. They'd survive until morning. Let it sit. That was the logic. Madison stepped closer to the board. The space for initials still empty. No replacement crew, no reschedule. Just one handler, one dog. Static. She reached out and tapped her glove lightly against the surface. The sound was soft, almost nothing. She didn't write anything, didn't argue. She just made contact. A reminder, not a request. No one spoke. The group had already moved on. Back to the main board. Back to shifting rotations and ground logistics. She turned and walked out of the tent without a word. Behind her, the flap swung shut. The storm hissed against the plastic cold air curling at the seams. Nobody followed. Nobody asked where she was going. Nobody cared that she was the only one still watching the weather, still thinking about the ridge. They had made their decision. The mission was nobody's, the slot was no one's, and Madison was not listed, not even once, not even in pencil. But she had seen the map. She knew the slope, and she didn't need their permission to act. The hangar sat mostly dark, lit only by the flicker of overhead lights struggling against the cold. Snow spilled through a crack beneath the eastern door, swirling in lazy spirals across the concrete floor. Madison walked in without a word, boots crunching quietly as she moved toward the one Blackhawk no one touched. Its frame was coated in frost nose, wrapped in a half-secured tarp that fluttered slightly from the wind. She reached for the first tie and loosened it, folding the fabric back in practiced motions. The skin of the aircraft was cold metal biting against her gloves as she ran her hand along the seam. She didn't hesitate. No checklist. No co-pilot. Just rhythm. Tap the left skid. Slide a finger along the tail boom. Check stabilizer's latches. Panel tension. She knew what to feel for even in the dark. Her father had taught her with birds older than this one in colder storms. Inside the cockpit, the seats were stiff with ice. She slid in and clicked the harness across her chest. The console screen blinked on dim orange under low voltage. She flipped the battery switch, paused, then keyed in her clearance code. The system denied access. No active crew assigned. Her eyes didn't move. Just her hand. She reached down to the left of the panel, opening a small, locked housing beneath the console. Inside sat a mechanical override switch protected by a clear plastic guard. She flipped it up and inserted a small key, the chain cold against her fingers. The key was old, worn smooth from years of use. It had belonged to her father. The override hummed low as she turned it. A second later, the engines stirred. One, then two. The cockpit trembled as the blades began to move. Slow, steady, sure. A voice echoed from the catwalk above. Someone saw her. Called down. She didn't look. Didn't answer. The instrument panel lit fully now, showing trim heading and wind vector. She adjusted pitch and throttle corrected yaw by instinct. There was no checklist to read. She didn't need one. The bird lifted off the ground with a hard thud, tires parting from the concrete, just as the wind slammed against the hangar again. Snow kicked up in every direction, rotor wash scattering it across the walls. Another shout followed, louder but lost in the roar. The Blackhawk climbed slowly, cutting into the sky like it belonged there. Madison stayed quiet, hands steady, jaw set. Outside, the storm twisted harder, sleet drawing white scars across the windshield. She adjusted trim again, slightly nose down to catch the updraft. Behind her, the base shrank away. The tower didn't log her flight. No beacon pinged. No one gave clearance. But she flew anyway, because someone had to. Because there was still a handler and a dog out there, and she wasn't going to wait for a permission that would never come. The Blackhawk pressed into the sky, its frame rattling under the push of the wind. Madison gripped the controls with both hands, her eyes flicking between instruments and the blurred white world outside. There was no horizon, no clear line of sky or ground, just shifting snow and gusts that hit like waves. The GPS flickered once, then went dark. She didn't bother tapping it again. A paper map sat folded beside her, creased from use, its corners worn thin. She didn't need to look at it. Every ridge, every contour, every narrow pass was memorized. She had flown this in simulation 100 times. In real weather, just once. It was enough. She adjusted pitch by feel, nose down slightly to catch a pocket of lift. Her feet shifted on the pedals, correcting for crosswind as the airframe shook again. The bird tilted, but she didn't flinch. She countered, leveled, let the skids drift low before rising again in a clean arc. Her father used to say you could hear the storm if you were quiet enough. Not with your ears, but through the metal, through the tremble in the cyclic, through the breath in your chest when the lift started to slip. Madison listened now, not to the warnings on the console, but to the bird itself. The ridge loomed ahead, not visible but sensed. Pressure shifted. Wind bent around the slope, pulling the nose gently right. She let it pull, then pushed back with just enough throttle to hold center. Too much, and she'd overshoot. Too little, and the rotors would drop her into the ravine. Snow blasted against the windshield, drawing tight white streaks. She blinked through it, wiping the glass with the edge of her glove. No autopilot, no co-pilot, no one to read the wind but her. She descended slightly, tail steady, keeping below the worst of the wind shear. Her left hand reached forward, brushing a note she had taped earlier to the panel. Coordinates, wind direction, drift estimate, not official data. Her own numbers, her own mind. The storm howled through a break in the ridge. Madison dipped the nose, then pulled it back up fast, letting the tail catch and rise. The lift felt thin. She rolled slightly left, corrected, then pressed forward again. Behind her, the rotor pitched high, matching the change in elevation. She didn't speak. Her face didn't move, but her whole body responded to the shifts. It was instinct now, all training, all memory, every lesson etched into her bones. The kind of flying no one teaches. The kind you just learn or you don't make it back. One green flicker blinked on the screen. Faint, too faint to be clean, but it was a signal. She adjusted gain, filtered noise, and found it again. The K9 beacon. Weak, but real. Somewhere below, in the white blur of snow and rock, someone was still alive. She banked hard-angled for descent and tightened the throttle just enough to hold steady. Her jaw clenched, eyes locked forward. Every second mattered now. Every breath timed to the pulse of the machine. The climb had turned. It was now a drop, and she was the only one who knew how to land. The valley opened in a sudden break between two rock faces, just wide enough for a single pass. Madison steadied the controls, guiding the bird into the gap as snow tore sideways across the windshield. The wind fought her every inch, pushing against the tail, slamming the skids, but she held. A low heat signature glowed on the scanner, flickering through static. Two forms close together, unmoving but alive. She made one full circle, checking the slope and approach, then dropped fast. Skids hit hard. The Blackhawk rocked once before settling. Ramped down, engines running, no time to waste. Madison unstrapped and moved to the back. The moment the cabin door opened, the storm hit her like a punch. Snow drove into her face. Cold snapped through her coat. But her boots held. Her body leaned into the wind, her steps slow and sure. 10 meters ahead, half buried in a drift, the K9 stood alert. Its ears were back breath shallow, but its eyes were steady. It didn't bark. It didn't move. Just stared at her like it had been waiting. Madison dropped to one knee and held out a gloved hand, palm up. The dog stepped forward. No hesitation. Just quiet trust. It reached her in 3 strides and stopped close, but not touching. She looked past it and saw the handler slumped in the snow. One leg splinted, his face pale under a crust of frost. His chest rose, shallow, but steady. She reached for his harness and adjusted the clips. Snow cracked away as she tugged him into position inch by inch. Her arms burned with the effort. The wind fought every movement. The dog stayed beside them, head low, body tight against the storm. They reached the ramp. Madison hauled the handler up first, bracing with her knees, pulling with her back. Inside, the light was dim, the floor wet with melt. The moment his body cleared the edge, she turned again. The dog stepped up on its own. No words, no commands, just emotion shared between them. Inside the aircraft, the ramp sealed. The roar outside dropped to a hum. Madison leaned against the wall for one breath, gloves pressed to her thighs, chest heaving. She checked the handler's pulse again. Still there, weak, but present. The dog curled beside him, one paw on his chest. Madison gave the latch one last tug, then returned to the cockpit. The instruments ticked low, warning of ice buildup. She adjusted trim, reset altitude, brought the engines up to full. The bird shuddered, rotors struggling for lift in the frozen air. She watched the gauge rise, then rise again, slowly, climbing. Outside, the storm hadn't slowed. Visibility was worse than before. But Madison didn't flinch. Her hands moved with quiet certainty, adjusting course by instinct. The Blackhawk pulled free of the ground and banked into the wind. Behind her, the dog didn't make a sound. The handler lay still, strapped to the deck. The snow clung to the corners of the cabin, then began to melt. Water ran in slow lines across the floor. Madison flew by feel. No voice in her ear, no beacon to guide her. Just the rhythm of the storm, the pressure in the controls, the memory of 100 flights before this one. She pushed through the chop, leveled the pitch, and climbed. They passed the ridge 10 minutes later. The final updraft caught the tail, kicked hard, then let go. She corrected, fast-rolled once, then righted. Her eyes stayed forward, jaw tight. And then just ahead, the base appeared through the white. Lights dull but visible, a flat stretch of gray waiting to receive them. She lowered the gear, held the line, brought them down fast, steady, sure. The skids hit ground. Snow blew wide in every direction. Madison powered down, slid the door open, and stepped out. Ground crew rushed forward, medics with stretchers. One tech reached for the handler, another called for vitals. The dog followed, staying close, its coat soaked, and its eyes never leaving Madison. She said nothing. She just stood there, breathing hard, braids stiff with ice. Then slowly she walked back to the cockpit, fingers raw inside her gloves. She looked once more at the ramp, the figures disappearing into the blur, the snow still falling. But different now. Not cruel. Just quiet. The kind of quiet that holds everything that just happened. The kind that doesn't need a single word. Inside the tower, no one said her name. The technician logged the incoming bird with no call sign, no assigned pilot, just a short note on weather clearance. It was marked as unusual traffic, then left alone. Outside, the snow kept falling. Not as hard now, not violent. Just soft enough to settle on her shoulders as she walked across the tarmac, boots soaked through braids stiff with ice. The rotors behind her slowed with each pass, steam rising from the tail. She didn't wait to be called, didn't stop by the mission tent. No one flagged her down. A few glanced up, maybe recognizing the jacket, maybe not. She walked straight past the line of heated crates and tents, heading toward the quieter side of the compound. Inside the barracks, the hall was empty. Lights dimmed for early morning standby. She passed closed doors and unused bunks, her footsteps soft on the floor. No one noticed. No one asked. Her room hadn't changed. Same blanket folded. Same map pinned on the wall. Same crate beside her cot with the logbook resting just where she'd left it. She sat down slowly, letting the cold unwind from her legs. She peeled off the gloves and draped them across the pipe. Water dripped from the fingertips. They sagged just slightly, leather curled like they still held the controls. She didn't look at them for long. She picked up the logbook, thumbed past earlier pages filled with tight handwriting, flight notes, storm readings, past exercises she had flown only in simulation. She reached the next clean line and paused. Then she wrote the date, the time, a short line, UH-60, unlisted flight, ridge pass clearance, K9 and handler recovered, solo lift, return complete, no rank, no signature, just ink. She closed the book and placed it back on the crate. The map above her head still had a faint smudge where her thumb had pressed into the paper earlier. The edges fluttered slightly from the heater's weak breath. She leaned back, eyes on the ceiling. Then the narrow window slit near the top of the wall. Outside, the snow had lightened. Sky still gray, but no longer pressing down. It just hung there cold and still. No one came to her door. No one called her name over comms. There was no debrief, no inquiry, no thanks. The mission remained unclaimed. The board still listed the slot as blank. But she had flown it, and that was enough. Not for the system, not for the record, but for her. Because sometimes what matters most isn't that someone sees. It's that you did what needed doing, and you knew you could. She sat there a while longer, hands resting in her lap. The silence filled the room, not heavy, just real. It didn't ask anything of her. It just let her be. Later she would check the gloves, dry them fully, fold them neatly, add a new mark to her personal map. But for now, she just sat still, letting the quiet hold her, letting the flight settle into memory. No medals, no mention, no line on the manifest, but a life saved, a dog returned, and a flight written by hand that no one else would ever read. That was enough. That had always been enough. There are people who move through the world quietly without fanfare or applause. They don't raise their voices. They don't chase attention. But when something truly matters, they are the ones who step forward. Madison didn't fly for recognition. She didn't take off into that storm to prove anyone wrong. She flew because someone needed help and no one else would go. She had every reason to sit back, every excuse to wait for orders that would never come. But something in her refused to let the moment pass. Something deep, shaped by years of experience, by the voice of her father, by the feel of cold air against metal. She didn't need the system's permission to know what she could do. Her hands already knew. Her body had already memorized the route. Her instincts were already moving before anyone else even considered it possible. The truth is, we spend too much time waiting for approval, waiting for someone to say we're ready, that we belong, that it's okay to act. But real strength doesn't wait for permission. It listens to what's right, and it moves. Madison didn't argue with the room. She didn't beg for a slot on the manifest. She simply prepared, quietly, fully, and when the time came, she flew. She flew without backup, without a team, without any guarantee that she'd come back. But she knew the ridge. She knew the weather. And she knew that staying grounded would haunt her far more than the storm ever could. She didn't fly for applause. She didn't do it for a headline. She did it because someone was out there freezing alone and hoping that someone might come, and she chose to be that someone. It's easy to believe that courage needs to be loud, that leaders must stand in front center stage. But more often the ones who change everything are the ones no one notices, the ones who don't speak much, the ones who just act. They show up, they get it done, and then they walk away quietly with nothing more than the knowledge that they did what mattered. Madison was one of those people, and that's what made her powerful. She didn't need her name on a board. She didn't need a formal thank you. The mission was never about that. It was about knowing she could do something, and choosing not to ignore that. She walked back into her room, wrote the mission in her own log, and didn't expect anyone to read it. But it mattered. That record mattered. Because sometimes you don't need the world to know. You just need to know yourself. She flew anyway, in the face of indifference, in silence, in whiteout cold, because she believed in something larger than policy, because she knew someone had to try. Maybe we all carry something like that inside us. A quiet sense of duty. A call that doesn't shout, but still pulls. And maybe what the world needs most are not louder voices, but steadier hands. If this story stayed with you even a little, take a moment to reflect. Share it with someone who might need to hear it. Follow along if you want more stories like Madison's. Because the strongest people are not always the ones who stand in the spotlight. Sometimes they're the ones who stand alone in a storm and fly anyway.